I'd like to welcome everybody to today's presentation on domestic and partner violence, risk and protective factors. I am your host, Dr. Donnelly Snipes. Now, I know y'all have probably had multiple domestic violence courses in the past, so I am going to try to make this as interesting and helpful as possible, so it's not just a total rehash of statistics. We are going to identify risk and protective factors and explore ways that clinicians can help prevent those risk factors and enhance the protective factors. Remember that behavior is a form of communication. I always go back to that. What is this behavior trying to communicate? How does abusive behavior, whether it's verbal abuse or physical abuse, how does that communicate the perception of threat? If somebody is being abusive, how does that communicate that at least when that behavior was formed, was initially reinforced, it was often a reaction to threat? Now on Tuesday, when we talked about bullying, remember that sometimes abusive or aggressive behavior can be rewarded, and in the future it may come up as a automatic response to a situation, maybe not a perception of threat, but in order to acquire rewards or maintain a certain level of power. But we do want to understand what are the benefits of this behavior right now, and where did it come from? How did this behavior become ingrained in this person's repertoire? The same thing is true for passive behavior. Why is it, in what way is being passive in this situation beneficial to this person? And in terms of a domestically violent relationship, or IPV, interpersonal violent relationship, obviously sometimes standing up to the abuser can be extraordinarily dangerous. So we can understand how that would be a functional reaction to the situation. We can understand that if somebody grew up in a household in which they witnessed violence, they may have learned that the appropriate response to violence is passivity, because that is the only safe response. They may have learned that it's not safe to try to leave. So we want to explore not only what's going on in the present moment, but what is the schema that people have developed over time that are informing and motivating this behavior. Violence is a form of aggression. Aggression is part of the fight or flee response. Remember, when we are threatened, we have 4 responses: fight, flee, freeze, or forget about it. And fight is obviously anger, aggression. Flee is obviously fear or withdraw. Sometimes fleeing just means withdrawing from the situation. Freeze can also be withdrawing or becoming passive, becoming less of a threat. And forget about it is the 4th, in which the person feels helpless and hopeless and just has no response. They're just like, screw it. I can't do anything to change this situation. We want to examine what skills or resources the person needs to feel safe. And this is true for the abuser as well as the survivor. And I am going to try very hard to remember to use the word survivor, because we want people to embrace that empowered mentality of surviving, not the powerless mentality of victimhood. Flee and freeze are common responses of survivors. What do these behaviors communicate? Communicates to me that they want to live. They want to survive, and this may be the only way they know how. Why don't they leave? Maybe they're terrified to leave. Maybe they believe that it's a greater threat to leave than to stay. Maybe, and in a lot of violent relationships, there is a significant power dynamic, and the abuser has created multiple different types of dependence for the other person. so they don't feel like they have power. The abusers often control finances. They often control friendships. They may control fun, the person's recreation. So we definitely want to look at those three at the very least, the three F's: finances, friends, and fun, because that may dominate the person's life, and they may not feel like they've got any resources to turn to, even if they mustered up the courage to leave. What skills or resources does the person need to be empowered to become safe? So we want to examine, and we want to examine in general in our communities. What resources do people need? Okay, I need to take this jacket off. Sorry, y'all. What resources do people need in our community to feel safe? And I'm going to get to it at some point, but in a lot of communities, we may have shelters for battered women, which is great. You know, we need to have those. But some of those shelters are not accessible to women with older children, especially older male children. Many of those shelters, most of those shelters, are not accessible to women with pets. And we know that in domestically violent relationships, pets are often also in jeopardy. So there are a lot of issues. It is also the fact that women are not the only people who are abused. Men can be abused too. And men need their own resources. They need their own shelters. So, you know, we can argue whether they should be co-ed or split or what they need to be. But ultimately, and you can make the argument for having women's shelters and men's shelters, but we do need shelters for men. We need shelters for both genders that welcome children of all ages. We need shelters for both genders that welcome pets, so people have a place to go. Or we need an alternate place that is willing, like a lot of rescues are out there. If you go on petfinder.com, there are a lot of rescues. Rescues have volunteers that are foster parents, and some rescues are willing to work with shelters to be temporary foster parents for animals that are coming out of a domestically violent situation. So the humans can go to a human shelter, and the pets are able to go to a pet foster in order to ensure their safety. We need to consider these things because a lot of us love our animals dearly, and we would be devastated if anything happened to them. We need to look more broadly about the skills and resources people need to be empowered to become safe. You know, do they need more job opportunities? Do they need better access to transportation? Do they need more affordable housing? You know, what types of services do they need? Some communities have started developing transitional living houses for people who are transitioning out of shelters, but they don't yet have the financial stability to get an apartment or a house on their own. So then they move into basically a halfway house that in which, 4 to 6 other survivors live in, and they build up their credit, they build up their savings, until which point they can afford the first last security on an apartment. And it's a stepwise transition. Another huge thing that's missing in programs for intimate partner violence intervention and even prevention is case management. Many of the people who have been involved in IPV relationships feel very overwhelmed. And it is so helpful to have a case manager that can sit down and help them chart out, okay, what is it that you want? Where do you want to be? What do you need so you can be safe and independent? Now, let's chart out the steps to get there. And that case manager helps the person stay on track. That case manager serves as a support person or a cheerleader. Technically, in most states, if not all states, case management doesn't have a state-regulated license. Anybody can be a case manager. So in most cases, places that can use volunteers who are willing to serve as case managers in the shelters and the halfway houses to help people move along in the process. Case management just takes a little bit of training. And, if you're interested in learning more about, using volunteers for case management, send me an email at support@allceus.com. I'd love to talk to you about it because I think it's a hugely underutilized resource, but I digress. Stockholm Syndrome is another thing that we talk about when we talk about intimate partner violence. And I use the term intimate partner violence because domestic implies that the people often are living together. And that's not necessarily true. This can be between people who are dating or in some sort of intimate relationship. Stockholm Syndrome. When experiencing abuse, the survivor may feel gratitude when the abuser treats them humanely or does not physically harm them. And to a certain extent, this can be extrapolated to emotional abuse. When we talk about physical abuse, we're including sexual in there. They may also attempt to appease the abuser to stay safe, and the abuser reinforces that the survivors are better off working with them instead of against them. And if you've worked with people who have been in violent relationships, you are aware of some of the messages that the abuser may send, such that make the survivor feel like they are not good enough, they are not capable, they are not lovable. They better be grateful for anyone that would give them attention because they are so awful. And that gets ingrained into the survivor's psyche. And that is something that they have to work really hard in the recovery process to erase. Think about messages that we learn, like our brain like a tape recorder, and they really have to work hard to erase those messages so they don't become their own worst critic. Risk factors, and the ones that I have an asterisk by are associated with both survivors and perpetrators. The ones that are don't have an asterisk are more often associated just with perpetrators. So low self-esteem is common in both perpetrators and survivors. Let's think about it. A perpetrator who has low self-esteem may fear abandonment. In response to that, they may become aggressive or abusive to maintain control of a relationship in order to prevent abandonment. That's only one possible explanation, but we're going to spitball a few things here. Poverty. In violent relationships, there's often a high level of stress, and we've seen over and over with lots of different things that poverty contributes to high levels of stress in families, in relationships. So poverty itself contributes to the risk of both being an abuser and a survivor. The survivors are often economically dependent on the abuser because the abuser controls all the money. That's another way that the abuser makes sure that the survivor cannot leave. Unemployment is very common, and the ones that are not only bold but also are underlined correlate with the 3 risk factors. You see 2 on this page. The 3 risk factors that were shown during the lockdowns, during the COVID pandemic, to significantly correlate with people who were at much higher risk for domestic violence. So there were some really interesting studies that we're going to talk about regarding the impact of COVID and the lockdowns on domestic violence and intergenerational transmission of mental health issues as well as domestic violence. But we'll get there. So unemployment often goes hand in hand with poverty because it contributes to economic stress. But unemployment also means that both people in the couple, if they're living together, are home with each other a lot of the time. And when there is tension, people tend to be more irritable, which means little things get under their saddle and really irritate them. And when you're together 24/7, like we were during the lockdowns, that can really exacerbate things and contribute to a lot more arguments, a lot more violence. Low academic achievement and low verbal IQ, interestingly enough, are mainly associated with perpetrators. We want to make sure that people are successful in school. We know that low academic achievement is associated with low self-esteem and depression in youth. I would hypothesize that low academic achievement contributing to low self-esteem contributes to fears of abandonment, which motivates aggressive, controlling behavior to prevent abandonment. Low verbal IQ could be associated with difficulty articulating one's needs and wants. When we can't articulate what we need and want, we have difficulty getting our needs met, and we feel ignored, abandoned, not worthy. So again, you can see how this might contribute to someone feeling desperate and getting frustrated and not feeling understood or listened to because they can't communicate it effectively, which results in increasing stress for them and increasing agitation. A young age is associated with the beginnings of violent behavior. Well, that prefrontal cortex, good old prefrontal cortex again, isn't developed completely until about 24 years of age. Prefrontal cortex is where we have our executive functioning, our problem solving, our impulse control, our emotional processing and regulation. So when someone who is younger gets distressed, they are more likely to emotionally dysregulate and behaviorally dysregulate than someone who is older. However, young age, remember, at the beginning, at the initiation of violent behavior. So we don't generally see somebody who has no problems with violence until the age of 40. Then all of a sudden they become an abuser. A lot of times we see that this behavior starts earlier in life. It gets rewarded. They get, the reaction. They get the person to stay. They, aren't abandoned, whatever the ultimate goal is, that gets rewarded. And so that behavior becomes ingrained in their repertoire. We need to examine, again, the function of the behavior and figure out what skills, tools, and resources does this person need to get that need met in a nonviolent way. For example, interpersonal skills, communication skills, emotional regulation skills may be essential to help them develop those healthy relationships so people won't abandon them, so people want to stay in relationships with them, and their relationships become characterized by honesty, trust, and respect instead of fear and domination. Heavy alcohol and drug use. Now, this is one that at any point in life can contribute to emotional and behavioral dysregulation or disinhibition. It's not an excuse. It is a factor that is associated. And so it's important for people to understand if they are mean drunks that, they probably shouldn't drink. And we know a lot of people, I think you probably know people, I know people who can handle their alcohol with no problem, or sometimes when they drink, they get sappy. And we know other people who, when they consume alcohol, they are very, very unpleasant to be around. And those people need to take a hard look at, whether they need to find an alternate way for de-stressing or whatever reason they're using that alcohol. Depression, and as clinicians, we can help people develop skills and tools to use for coping, for stress management, and to address dysregulation as opposed to or instead of using substances. Depression and suicide attempts are associated, interestingly enough, more with perpetrators than with survivors. And, I find that to be interesting, but a lot of times, if you think of somebody, for example, who has borderline personality disorder, and they are either in love or in hate with you. There's no gray area there. There's a lot of emotional dysregulation. There's a lot of extremes in behavior as well as mood. And this is not an uncommon pattern to see in people who are abusers. They may, think about that power and control wheel. They have that honeymoon period where everything's good. They're being nice. Things are going well. Tension starts to build. Then they have an explosion. Then they feel guilty. They become depressed. And at a certain point, they may feel so out of control of their own behaviors, and they may hate themselves so much for being abusive that they become suicidal. We do need to be cognizant of that. Most people, a good proportion, maybe I won't say most, a good proportion of people who are on the abuser side, tends to be an ego dystonic behavior. They recognize that is not an okay behavior, and they do have an amount of guilt and remorse. But when they're triggered, they fly into this blinding rage that they feel they've got no control over. And it's up to us to help them develop skills and tools in order to start being able to regulate and mitigate those reactions, starting to notice their things that are making them irritable when they're starting to get upset before they become enraged. Notice those physiological signs, to be aware of their triggers for rage and start dealing with those. Why are these triggers for me? Maybe processing any issues there, as well as understanding, this is a trigger for me, so I know that I can deal with it this way. For example, sitting in a doctor's office and the doctor's running an hour and 20 minutes late is a trigger. I mean, that is a sign of disrespect for just about anybody. And for someone who has difficulty dealing with rejection, disrespect, fear of abandonment, that can be a huge trigger. So it's important that that person knows that that's a trigger for them and has a plan for how to deal with it so they don't get to the point where they erupt in a rage in the doctor's office. Generally with patients that I have that have that kind of an issue, we talk about, all right, doctors run late sometimes. You can call ahead to see if the doctor's running on time. And, if they are, get there on time. If not, you can adjust. And when you get there, ask if the doctor's running on time. If they still are, great. And then sit down and wait. And after 15 minutes past your appointment time, ask again what the status is. If they don't know, won't tell you, or the doctor's running way behind, reschedule. Or maybe leave and then call back and reschedule. Those are options. Those are empowering options to take instead of brooding and waiting and building that rage until it just erupts. Abusers often lack nonviolent social problem-solving skills, which is kind of what I was talking about. We really need to brainstorm what are your triggers and what are some ways you could deal with it. And this is a great group activity for people to identify triggers that are common to a lot of people. It's very normalizing to do this in a group and then talk about, okay, what is realistic to expect in this situation, and what are 2 or 3 different ways you could handle it and without exploding. Antisocial or borderline personality traits and conduct problems are also quite common. Well, let's think about that. Personality disordered behaviors often begin in early childhood. Personality disordered behaviors often develop, I'm not going to say always, but often develop, my experience has been, and the research has shown, in response to trauma. Personality disordered traits often indicate a person who has a gross lack of safety and a sense of personal power. So that sets a person up to be one that quickly dysregulates at any time they perceive there's a threat to them. If they are almost always, if they are frequently hypervigilant because they don't feel safe as a result of prior trauma, then they are going to be scanning, they're going to be noticing the negative, they're going to be more in a fight or flight state of mind, activated HPA axis, and that can contribute to highly reactive behaviors. We do need to explore trauma history with both survivors as well as perpetrators and recognize how the past experiences can be impacting their current behaviors and reactions to situations. Contextual cognitive behavioral therapy is extremely helpful in this kind of situation because, for example, a youth that grew up in a household where the caregivers were violent with one another may not have felt safe, may not have been able to escape the situation because they were 6, 7, 8 years old. In that context, they were in danger. In that context, they were feeling threatened and feeling helpless, and they kind of were. Now, as a grown-up, they are the ones perpetrating. They are not at risk of having somebody perpetrate against them. They are the ones perpetrating. And in this situation, what parts of it remind them of the past and their feeling of helplessness? What's triggering that fight or flight reaction in them? And how is that related to the past? And how can they process that? Perpetrators often have poor behavioral control and impulsiveness. When we are exposed to trauma in early childhood, while that prefrontal cortex is developing, it doesn't develop quite the same way. And I've made the analogy of think of your prefrontal cortex like a clay vase that you're making, and you've got it on the little spinny wheel, and it hasn't gone to the kiln yet. It's a beautiful vase, but until it goes to the kiln, until it is fully developed, it is much easier to alter its shape, alter its functioning. The same thing is true for our brain. Once it goes to the kiln, once we get to 24 years and that brain is theoretically fully developed, then it is much harder to cause damage to the neural networks. But during development, it is much easier. It doesn't mean that people can't develop impulse control strategies. They can work around it, just like somebody recovering from a stroke can develop workarounds. Our brains, we only use a very small fraction of our brains. So we actually can, in many cases, work around what I'm going to refer to as traumatic brain injury. But it takes time, it takes effort, it takes a lot of hard work. Somebody who has a history of being physically abusive obviously is at a greater risk of continuing to be an abuser. But people who have been abused, social learning, they learn how to interact from their prior significant relationships. And if prior significant relationships controlled them through abuse, they learn to control others through abuse. And it may seem, unfortunately, normal to them because that's what they've always known. We do need to examine the nurture part of nature and nurture in their family history to find out what kinds of messages did you get from your caregivers, from your family, from your community when you were growing up about physical violence, about verbal violence. Emotional dependence and insecurity are, interestingly enough, both correlated with both being an abuser and a survivor. Being in emotionally or being in intimately violent relationships can create a level of emotional dependence. But sometimes people who have grown up in a household in which, the attachment was very insecure, they look for they tend to gravitate towards relationships that provide a certain amount of security and control because they never felt safe in their family of origin. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be dysfunctional, but that is one of those things. You want to think and process with the person. If they tend to be frequently or repeatedly getting into relationships that are emotionally, physically, financially abusive, what is it about those relationships, those people, that attract them to it? Are they replaying something from the past? Are they trying to fix a relationship? There are a lot of psychodynamic theories, but we do want to explore the fact and recognize that a lot of people in these relationships are what I would call parasitically dependent on one another. They are so insecure that they have to have that other person, and they are terrified that that other person is going to leave them. And both people just operate in this realm of terror most of the time. A belief in strict gender roles may contribute to domestic violence, may contribute to problems in relationships. Now, obviously, this tends to be more when there is a cisgender male abusing a cisgender female. We don't want to get too hung up on that because there is a lot of variability now that we recognize that gender roles aren't necessarily so binary. But it is important to recognize that in some more traditional cultures, that strict gender roles can contribute to the development of an imbalance of power in relationships, which can be taken to an extreme in dysfunctional settings. Some relationships adhere to very strict gender roles and are actually pretty healthy. My in-laws, for example, they're from a different time, but they adhere to very strict gender roles and they seem to be extraordinarily happy. It's not abusive, and they work quite well together. Hostility towards, and you notice I crossed out women, again, because we need to get away from this binary notion of gender and recognize that hostility towards intimate partners can contribute to abuse. So if you are, going into a bar or some sort of setting to meet a partner, whatever type of partner that you are attracted to, recognizing that if you have hostility towards that type of person in general, towards submissive people, towards dominant people, towards women, towards whomever, if you have a general hostility towards the same type of person you're getting into a relationship with, that may translate later to increasing hostility and control issues once you are in a intimate relationship. Attitudes that accept or justify intimate partner violence obviously are going to contribute. We want to examine where these attitudes came from and examine their logic, their truth, and their fallacies. Unplanned pregnancy for both partners can contribute to intimate partner violence. Finding out that there's an unplanned pregnancy can trigger a rage. Feeling like you've got to stay in a relationship because of an unplanned pregnancy can trigger some very dysfunctional emotional dynamics. So you can see there's a lot of issues that may happen with an unplanned pregnancy. And being a victim of physical or psychological abuse, we talked about that one already, can contribute to continuing this learned behavior. Additional characteristics of victims or survivors. They feel powerless over many aspects of their life, and this is the victim mentality. We want to help people examine what aspects of their life they do or could have power over. They may not have power over much of anything right now, but what could they have power over? What resources actually are out there to support them? They may think intense jealousy proves a partner's love. We want to explore that. And I've found a lot of times that group therapy with both abusers together and then survivors together. I don't put the two together. But when they are in a group with people who have similar experiences to them, there is a lot of normalization and a lot of calling each other out on maybe cognitive errors, which can be extraordinarily helpful coming from a peer, more so, in my opinion, than from a clinician. People who are victims are often uncertain of their basic needs. In order to be empowered, they need to develop mindfulness, figure out what do they need and how can they get those needs met. It's extraordinarily liberating to people once they start figuring out that, hey, I can do this. People who have requested a protective or restraining order or left their abuser are at much higher risk, unfortunately, of experiencing violence because that pushes the abuser to a point of panic, of fear, of rage, and they become much more impulsive. They have those blinders on. They're in that adrenaline haze, probably thinking in their emotional mind, and whatever is fueling their fear, whatever is fueling their need to control things, just becomes exponentially bigger at that point. Relationship factors, marital conflict, fights, tension, and other struggles can trigger intimate partner violence, especially if people have poor communication skills. If they don't have the ability to listen, to paraphrase, to respect boundaries, that can be really challenging. Jealousy, possessiveness, and negative emotion within an intimate relationship also contribute to intimate partner violence. Remember, jealousy is a fight or is an anger emotion. You're angry at somebody else, or you're fearful that somebody else has something that you want or is going to take something that you have. So jealousy and possessiveness can kind of go together. There is a threat there. When somebody feels jealous or possessive, there is a threat there. So we need to examine with the person, where's that possessiveness, where's that jealousy coming from? What's causing them to feel that way? What are the facts supporting their beliefs? And is that accurate in this present situation? Or are they projecting stuff from the past? Negative emotion, hostility, anger, hopelessness, guilting one another within an intimate relationship can also develop into a emotionally and or physically violent scenario. People who have marital instability, divorces, or lots of separations, if they have a pattern of not being able to maintain a relationship, we want to examine why that is. We want to look at some attachment styles, some communication issues, and what's going on. What is similar between their repeated relationships? What is similar between these partners? What is different between these partners? And what are the similarities and differences in the reasons that these relationships ended, to maybe see if there are some themes that we can examine to see if there is some, unhealthy need meeting happening. Dominance and control of the relationship by one partner over the other can lead to intimate partner violence. It doesn't always. Some people prefer to have very traditional gender roles, and that is their choice, and they're very happy that way. Thank you very much. So we do need to be respectful of culture and personal preferences. Unhealthy family relationships and interactions contribute to both being an abuser as well as a survivor, because often, if you grew up in an unhealthy environment, you learned unhealthy coping and behaviors, reactions, and interpersonal skills. So you take all that unhealthiness, you translate it to your own personal relationship. You start repeating those same problems in your new relationship. And since your family of origin was unhealthy, you probably don't have great support from them either, so you may feel isolated and helpless there too. So we need to make sure that people develop good interpersonal skills. They need to assess their interpersonal skills and develop some healthy relationships, whether it's with their family of origin or otherwise. Association with antisocial and aggressive peers. Ideally, people associate with pro-social people, but it is important to recognize that, for example, people who are in gangs tend to be in more aggressive, dominant, abusive relationships than people who aren't in gangs. Parents with less than a high school education may be at higher risk for creating a family environment in which there is violence, because less than a high school education often translates to lower socioeconomic status, higher poverty, higher stress. Doesn't mean it always happens. Some people cope very well, thank you very much. They, are able to get by. They have social supports to help them get through. So I'm not saying that poverty always results in this. It's just one of those things that we want to look for as a risk factor. Additionally, less than a high school education also correlates to poor school performance, which is associated, like I said earlier, with low self-esteem. So the earlier we can get into those schools and make sure that students are being assessed for learning disabilities, ADHD, depression, those sorts of things, making sure that they have food in their bellies so they can focus in school, and they're being taught in a way that they can learn, auditory, visual, kinesthetic. The earlier we can get in there and start assuring student success and helping them learn how to learn, the better off they're going to be, and the more protected against low self-esteem and fears of abandonment and low socioeconomic status, because they will begin to have those successes and be able to hopefully get one of those high-wage, high-demand jobs. Having few friends and being isolated from other people is that third characteristic that has been associated with the dramatic increase in intimate partner violence during the COVID lockdowns, because we couldn't get out. Even if you could talk to somebody on FaceTime or Zoom or whatever, that was all well and good. But if you were living in terror, if you were living in a household in which there was a lot of stress and arguing and fighting, then that actually could have worsened things, because the abuser may have felt rejected or ignored because the survivor was talking to a social support. And witnessing interpersonal violence between parents as a child also contributes to believing that that is a normative behavior, or learning those skills and not having any other options. Community and societal risk factors. Community poverty and associated factors like overcrowding, having 6 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment, high unemployment rates, which leads to 6 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment, can contribute to tension. Community poverty. We've become a society, I don't know how it was 100 years ago. I can't imagine living without air conditioning, but I know there are people who live in places where it gets hot in the summer and they don't have air conditioning. We know that heat and discomfort keeps us from sleeping well. Lack of quality sleep contributes to irritability. Irritability contributes to stress, contributes to violence. We can see how these things build upon each other. Think of Maslow's hierarchy. We need our basic needs met: safe housing and reasonable physical comfort. You may not be able to keep it 62 degrees all year long, but reasonable physical comfort so you are not, sweltering all the time or freezing your butt off. Lack of social services and institutions that support development of a healthy community. When people are isolated, they have more difficulty dealing with life on life's terms. When people are isolated, then they tend to have fewer people to turn to if they start developing problems in their relationships. When I talk about social services, I'm talking about, SNAP, food stamps, housing services, community programs, boys and girls clubs, after school care, churches, synagogues, anywhere people can go outside of their own home, clubhouses in apartment complexes, anywhere people can go outside of their own home to interface with other human beings and develop some sort of a sense of community. Poor neighborhood support and cohesion. We see this a lot in our lower socioeconomic neighborhoods because people move to where the jobs are. And if there are no jobs in your community, then people are probably not going to stay there for very long. So again, you don't have that support and cohesion. Weak community sanctions against intimate personal violence. Example, unwillingness of neighbors to intervene in situations in which they witness violence. And it doesn't mean having to see it. You can hear your neighbors having a knockdown drag out through the wall, and unwillingness to intervene, whether it's calling law enforcement or whatever is the safe method. Generally, that's the safe method. Easy access to alcohol and drugs. Alcohol is not a problem for everybody, but easy access to it makes it more accessible to those people that do have problems with it. Traditional gender norms and gender inequality may contribute to the development of violence in some situations. And I can't emphasize enough how much we have to look at the individual relationships. My grandparents had very traditional gender roles, but they were very happy the way things were. My grandmother didn't feel oppressed in any way. So it's important to examine the culture, and that includes the age group of the people that you're working with. Cultural norms that support aggression towards others, obviously that's going to contribute. A weak educational system and low graduation rate. That's going to contribute to poverty. That's going to contribute to low self-esteem. That's going to contribute to increased stress. So this is one of those things that we can get in on the ground floor for prevention. and pandemic lockdowns. The rate of intimate partner violence across countries, they looked at multiple different countries. The average rate of increase of intimate partner violence during the lockdown period was 30%. And that includes in the US. That's disturbing. And finally, in the article that talked about domestic violence during the lockdown, they talked about the ongoing repercussions of lockdowns and acute stress. So let's just look at this diagram really quick. Acute stress led to increases in domestic violence, which led to neurobiological dysregulation, that HPA axis dysregulation, brain structural dysfunction. It led to problems in the functioning of the brain. When the brain is revved up, when that HPA axis is hyperactive for too long, you get a whole bunch of glutamate building up in the brain, and that actually becomes neurotoxic. When you're stressed out for too long, it actually starts killing brain cells. Altered hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So we start having what we've talked about in prior classes called hypocortisolism. At a certain point, when you're running that hot and the brain starts noticing, oh, hey, we're killing off brain cells, then it dials back its sensitivity. And it says, okay, I am not going to react to everything right now because it's not safe. But when it does react, it reacts in an exaggerated response. And I've called this before the flat to the furious. So somebody is just kind of blah, flat most of the time. Nothing gets them too excited. Nothing gets them too happy. But when that sensitivity meter is actually finally triggered, they go into a fury. So we have increased domestic violence leads to neurobiological dysregulation, leads to neurocognitive deficits. If you start killing off enough brain cells, and that HPA axis is regularly activated or hyper or hypoactivated, it's going to alter your ability to use that prefrontal cortex, that executive functioning, to think, to sleep well, to clear out the adenosine, which is going to lead to stress-related disorders, cognitive impairments, socio-behavioral maladjustment. You're going to become irritable, and emotion regulation problems. You're going to feel like everything is a crisis because you're in that state where you just can't take one more thing. This may lead to transgenerational transmission of violence because people get stuck in this place where their HPA axis is perpetually dysregulated. They've actually caused physiological changes to their brain, reduction in hippocampal volume as well as other things, which leads back to more domestic violence. And the people who grow up in these environments witness the domestic violence, experience this stuff, develop cognitive impairments, and even more significant neurocognitive deficits because their brains are still developing, which leads to, through social learning of inappropriate or unhealthy behaviors, as well as lack of learning effective coping behaviors, they grow up to be more likely to be either perpetrators or victims of violence, and the cycle continues. So we really need to examine what's going on. What is, whether it's COVID-19 or extreme poverty or, violence, what is going on with our population, wherever you're at, that is causing perpetual acute stress? And that's almost an oxymoron there, perpetual acute stress. But it's like every time the person gets up, it feels like Groundhog Day. And it's the same trauma every single day. And they go to bed, they hope it's going to end, and they hope they're going to wake up to something different. And poof, they wake up the next morning, and guess what? It's more of the same. So like I said, it's not just COVID, but we do want to examine, what factors in our people's environment. And if you go back to Uri Brofenbrenner's socioecological model, it really gives you more points to look at. what things in the person's individual, in the person's microsystem, in their mesosystem, and in their macrosystem are contributing to chronic stress that is increasing their risk for domestic violence and the beginning and perpetuation of this cycle. Intimate partner violence is all too common of an occurrence. Many risk factors can be mitigated with self-esteem development, distress tolerance and impulse control skills, coping and problem-solving skills, communication and interpersonal skills. Now, come on, people, we can start teaching these things in elementary school or before. I know there are books out there written for toddlers that help start teaching these kinds of things. Emotional awareness, responsive educational systems to facilitate life success. Not everybody is cut out to go to four-year college. Not everybody likes book learning. So we need to have educational systems that are responsive to the people who want to go into trades, who would do better with a different kind of occupation. Community services designed to ensure that every person gets their basic needs met, from food, shelter, love, and belonging. People have difficulty with self-actualization and all that stuff if they're not getting their basic needs met. Parent education in high school. Start teaching in high school health classes and wherever else. Start teaching youth how to be good parents, and whether that means parenting themselves or if they choose to have children, parenting their children. And availability of safe, child, and pet-friendly shelters for both genders. All righty. I covered a lot. I know some of it was probably old hat for you. Hopefully, I gave you some new things to think about in terms of ways we can approach these issues with our clients, as well as needs we might need to address in our community for prevention, as well as to create a recovery-oriented system of care. Everybody, have an amazing weekend. Stay warm, stay safe, and I will see you next week. If this podcast helps you help your clients or yourself, please support us by purchasing your CEUs at allceus.com or getting your agency to sponsor an episode. A direct link to the on-demand CEUs for this podcast is at allceus.com/podcast CEUs. That's allceus.com/podcast CEUs. To sponsor an episode of Counselor Toolbox and reach over 50,000 clinicians per week, go to allceus.com/sponsor. Thank you.